In the early hours of May 6, 1982, 2 days after the sinking of HMS Sheffield, a phone rang in an officer's room at Tandil Air Base. It was not a departure order, not a red alert. It was something different. Report to the flight line without your flight suit and do not ask questions. Captain Alejandro Rivas had spent weeks flying missions against the British fleet. He had watched crewmates take off and never return. He had heard over the radio the final seconds of men he had known since flight school. He knew the war was no longer symbolic. It was pure attrition. When he arrived at the flight line, he saw them. 10 silhouettes lined up in the half-darkness. Mirages. But not his own. They had no visible registration numbers, no clear markings, and the mechanics working around them did not speak with Argentine accents. For a few seconds, no one explained anything. Then came the phrase that changed everything. These aircraft do not exist. And from today, neither do you. What Alejandro did not know at that moment was that he had just entered an operation that would never be officially acknowledged. A mission where the aircraft were ready to fly toward the Falklands, but where the enemy was not only the Royal Navy. Chile was watching, the United States was listening, and the United Kingdom was analyzing every movement in South America. If those mirages took off heading south, the war could cease to be bilateral. But if they did not take off, all the risk would have been assumed in silence. Alejandro looked at the fuselage of one of those aircraft and ran his hand across the cold metal. They were not new, they were not miraculous, but they represented something that was beginning to run scarce in the war. Options. In that instant, he understood that his next mission would not simply be attacking a frigate, it would be sustaining a threat. And in modern aerial warfare, sometimes the threat weighs more than the shot itself. Alejandro had been flying mirages since he was a lieutenant. He knew every vibration of the engine, every response of the wing in a tight turn, every limit before entering a stall. But these were not exactly the same. At first glance, they appeared identical, but the details spoke. The panels had different configurations. Some systems were calibrated to a different standard. The available weaponry expanded the possibilities. And, above all, the way they had arrived was not normal. There was no ceremony, no official reception, no communique. The aircraft appeared in the early hours of the morning and were moved into closed hangars. The markings had been removed, the registration numbers erased. Foreign technicians worked in silence alongside the Argentines, exchanging technical terms without ever mentioning their origin. Alejandro received clear instructions: immediate training, maritime profile, low altitude, maximum discretion. The implicit message was even clearer. If anyone asks, these aircraft have always been here. During the first days, the work was intense and precise. Simulations of low-level attacks against naval targets, virtual launches, coordination with refueling aircraft, exhaustive review of missiles and guidance systems. The war kept advancing in the South Atlantic while they trained in secret. Every day brought new reports: frigates damaged, positions bombed, casualties on the ground. Alejandro listened to the briefings with his jaw tight. He knew that every day without intervening was a day when others were bearing the risk. But the order had still not come. One afternoon, while reviewing the flight plan for an eventual deployment south, one of the foreign technicians spoke in a low voice, almost as if thinking aloud. If they take off, there is no going back. It was not an exaggeration. If those mirages entered combat, the United Kingdom would interpret it as the conflict expanding. Chile would take note, the United States would respond, diplomacy would become fragile. This was not just an air mission, it was a red line. And Alejandro was beginning to understand that his role was to be ready. Because in modern warfare, the mere possibility of an additional squadron appearing on the radar can force the enemy to redistribute forces, change patrol patterns, and modify plans. The threat also fights, but the threat demands cold blood. One night, while walking alone across the flight line, Alejandro stopped in front of his assigned aircraft. The metal reflected the faint light of the hangar. He ran his hand along the wing and thought about something he had never considered before. What if the most important mission of his career consisted of not taking off? That question began to weigh more heavily than any missile under his wings, and he still did not know that soon he would be sitting in the cockpit with the engines running, waiting for an order that could change the war, or erase him from history forever. Training stopped being simulation the day the pre-alert order arrived. It was not yet a combat mission. It was something more subtle. Immediate availability, real configuration. That meant the Mirages had to be armed, missiles mounted, auxiliary tanks installed, flight profile already assigned. Alejandro and his wingman spent the afternoon checking every detail. There was no margin for error. They could not afford a technical failure in a deployment that officially did not exist. While the technicians adjusted connections and verified guidance systems, information arrived that raised the tension further. Intelligence had detected increased surveillance activity in the northern region. Chilean radars more active, intercepted communications, movements that did not appear coincidental. The war was not only in the South Atlantic, it was also in the silence of the continent. The plan was clear and dangerous at the same time. If the order came, they would take off from Tandil, heading south, integrating into the Argentine operational framework as if they had always been part of it. But the first phase was not the Falklands. The first phase was crossing the Argentine sky without generating political noise. No unnecessary communications, no open transmissions, nothing that could be interpreted as external intervention. Alejandro climbed into the cockpit that night for an engine test. The ignition was clean. The turbine responded firmly. The indicators were within parameters. But the silence on the frequency was different from usual. There was none of the typical bustle of a base at war. There was restraint. As he taxied slowly toward the runway threshold, he felt something he had not experienced on previous missions against the fleet. It was not fear of combat. It was the awareness that this takeoff could expand the war beyond the islands. From the tower came the instruction: hold position. The seconds began to stretch. Ahead, beyond the horizon, the sky was clear. No alarms, no missiles, no direct enemy radar. And yet the tension was denser than in any previous engagement, because this time it was not just about surviving the visible enemy. It was about not provoking the invisible one. Alejandro looked at the instruments. Everything ready. He looked at the clock. The order could come at any moment. And if it did, the roar of those engines would not only announce an attack, it would announce that the war had crossed a line that until then had been held in check. But the order did not come. Engines at idle, fuel slowly burning, waiting. And in that wait, Alejandro understood something that would change his perception of the conflict forever. In modern warfare, the most dangerous moment is not always the combat itself. It is the instant just before. If stories like this are surprising you, subscribe and stay with me, because what comes next is even more striking. The early hours of June 12th did not begin with sirens. They began with a short, almost cold message. Possible operational window. Full readiness. That phrase meant one thing only. The South was at its limit. British forces were advancing on key positions. Argentine exhaustion was evident. If there was ever a moment to introduce an unexpected variable into the equation, It was now. Alejandro arrived at the hangar before dawn. The Mirages were already lined up. Technicians working in silence. No one spoke more than necessary. That day was no longer training. The missiles were active, the configurations were real, the auxiliary tanks were full. The plan called for a low-level flight profile heading south, integration with the Argentine air structure, and eventual deployment toward the operations zone. There was no final confirmation yet, but everything was prepared as if takeoff were imminent. One of the intelligence officers explained the context without drama. If this is executed, the international reaction will be immediate. But the tactical impact could alter enemy air pressure for days. In a war measured in hours, that was everything. Alejandro climbed into the cockpit with the feeling of entering a space where there was no longer room for doubt. He did not think about politics. He thought about his fallen comrades, about the pilots who had gone out against the fleet and never came back. If those aircraft could relieve the pressure, even minimally, it was worth it. The engine ignited with a contained roar. One by one, the Mirages came to life. From the tower came the instruction, hold position, await final confirmation. The runway was clear, the sky too. On the internal frequency, absolute silence. Alejandro looked toward the runway threshold. He imagined the takeoff, the brutal acceleration, the landing gear retracting, the south growing beneath the wings. He imagined the enemy's reaction too, more patrols, more missiles in the air, more regional surveillance. In that instant, he understood that they were not only prepared to fight, they were prepared to escalate the war. The minutes passed. The order did not come. At the base, no one moved without reason. Outside, the country slept, unaware that a single decision could change the course of the conflict in a matter of seconds. And then the message arrived. It was not an attack order. It was something much shorter. Cancel. Hold on ground. Alejandro did not move his head, did not respond. He simply reduced power. The roar descended until it became a metallic murmur. The war, at that exact moment, had taken a different path. Not for lack of will, not for lack of means, but because the strategic window had closed. Days later, on June 14th, Argentina announced its surrender. The Mirages remained intact, armed, ready, but they never flew toward the Falklands. And Alejandro understood something that few grasp in the heat of combat. Sometimes, the most decisive mission is the one that is never executed. Because it forced the enemy to calculate. Because it provided options when there appeared to be none. Because it sustained morale at the most critical moment. It left no craters. It left uncertainty. And in war, uncertainty is also a weapon. The cancellation order did not mean relaxation. It meant transition. In the days following June 12th, the Mirages remained in operational configuration. No one dismounted missiles, no one removed external tanks, no one spoke of immediate withdrawal, because until the surrender was official, the war still existed. And as long as it existed, so did the possibility that those aircraft would take off. Alejandro noticed something curious in the intelligence reports that began circulating at the base. The Royal Navy had adjusted its aerial patrol patterns. Greater coverage, more caution in certain corridors. It was not direct confirmation, but it was an indication. Someone on the other side was calculating additional scenarios. The British knew Argentina was seeking reinforcements. They knew there were unusual movements in South America. They had no definitive proof, but they could not ignore the possibility either. And in modern warfare, it is not enough to know what the enemy has. You have to anticipate what it might have. That might force his plan modifications. Alejandro understood then that his squadron had been fulfilling an invisible function. They had not launched missiles, had not crossed the line toward the Falklands, but they had existed in the equation. And that alone altered the board. One afternoon, while part of the weaponry was being dismounted following the official confirmation of surrender, one of the foreign technicians looked at him in silence and said something that stayed with him. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is the one that is ready but not used. It was not consolation. It was cold analysis. If the war had extended one more week, perhaps those mirages would have entered combat. If a key position had held on a little longer, perhaps the takeoff order would have arrived. But war does not wait for plans to reach perfection. It is decided by attrition. And when the surrender was made public, the operation automatically passed into the territory of absolute silence. No photographs, no statements, no official acknowledgement. The aircraft began to lose the discrete modifications that had made them non-existent. The technicians returned the same way they had arrived, without headlines, without formal farewells. Alejandro watched the last movements from the flight line. He felt no frustration, no complete relief. He felt something more complex. He had been minutes away from changing the dimension of the conflict, and no one would ever know. Years later, as history began to be reconstructed in greater detail, he understood the true magnitude of what had happened. It was not a symbolic operation. It was a latent threat, an invisible line crossed without being fully crossed. Because if those mirages had taken off heading south, the war would no longer have been solely Argentina against the United Kingdom. It would have been something else entirely. And perhaps for the first time, Alejandro understood that history does not always remember those who fire. Sometimes history also depends on those who were ready to do so, and it was not necessary. When the last mirages were made official again, when the markings returned to their place and the hangars recovered their usual routine, everything seemed normal. But it was not, because for weeks those aircraft had been something more than machines. They had been a possibility, and in war, possibilities carry weight. Alejandro returned to his country without public farewells. No decorations, no speeches. Officially, nothing extraordinary had occurred. Yet he knew what had almost happened. He knew that for hours he had held in his hands a decision that could have expanded the conflict at a regional level. He knew that if the takeoff order had come, there would have been no going back. The Falklands War ended on June 14th, but for those who participated in that silent operation, the story remained suspended at an invisible point. With the passing of years, indications began to emerge. Declassified documents, partial testimonies, carefully worded statements. And slowly, something fundamental came to be understood. The presence of those aircraft forced a recalculation. British intelligence services detected movements, adjusted patrols, evaluated scenarios. They could not confirm a direct intervention, but they could not rule it out either. And that doubt altered plans. It was not decisive in terms of direct combat. It was decisive in terms of strategic pressure. Because war is not fought only with bombs, it is fought with uncertainty. Alejandro understood then that his mission had not been a failure. It had been preventive. It had been a card on the table that was never played, but that forced the adversary to think it could be played at any moment. And in a conflict where every decision is measured in seconds, that changes behavior. Today, when someone asks whether it was worth risking so much without firing a single missile, the answer is simple. Yes. Because in May 1982, in a silent early morning, an invisible line was crossed. A line that could have turned the war into something far larger. A line that proved that solidarity between nations can exist even when no one sees it. It left no craters, no photographs. It left something more powerful. The certainty that at the most critical moment, someone was willing to intervene. And sometimes, in real history, that is enough. If you enjoy stories that almost no one told and want to discover what really happened behind the official headlines, subscribe now. Here we do not repeat history, we unearth it.